I welcome you on behalf of our committee to the last session of the annual Desmond Grieve Summer School, of which this is the 27th. And as you know, the purpose of the school is to look at particular issues confronting Ireland and to try and suggest alternatives to the current political and intellectual orthodoxy. And the programme this weekend, I think, did that in relation to several areas. All of them quite important and complex areas and rather different. Some people have said the school is trying to do too much in one weekend, and if any people have any suggestions as to how things might be improved or made better, or suggestions for the committee, they'd be very welcome if you pass them to me or to Frank Keown or to any of the other members of the committee that are around the place. Just one, again, small housekeeping item. If anyone hasn't signed the attendance sheet, would you be so good as to do so? I'll pass it around, and there's no need if you've signed already, obviously, to sign it again. And after the session, some of us would go around to the Long Stone. I expect to have a drink at the pub around there in Townsend. It was very quiet on the Sunday. It was a hell on Friday night. It would not have been possible. But I'd now like to introduce the chairman of the final session of the school. Mary Cullen has agreed to chair it, and she's of course a very distinguished historian. Who taught in Maynooth, the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, for many years. She's been particularly interested, as some of you will know, in feminist history and feminist perspectives on Irish history. And was author last year, wasn't it, of an important volume, Telling It Our Way, Essays in Gender History. Which
Thank you, Tony. Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're here to talk about the appalling carnage of World War I and why it happened. And we all know that it emerged actually in the growing tensions and conflicts between European states throughout the 19th and the early 20th centuries. And these were both to extend their own control over areas they saw as important to their interests, but equally to prevent rivals from gaining any advantage. Both those things were there. And the tensions and the conflicts, they extended beyond Europe itself into the wider world, and very notably in the later decades of the 19th century, when European states carved up almost the entire continent of Africa between them. And so, did World War I come about by accident, by states sleepwalking into it, as has been argued, or was it an inevitable outcome of this imperialism? And imperialism is understood as the extension of a state's rule over other territories, cultural and economic domination being involved. And from the second half of the 19th century, imperialism was developing in a way that commentators at the time of World War I, many of them, including Lenin, saw as being closely intertwined with the development of capitalism moving onwards towards finance monopoly capitalism. And the basic characteristic of capitalism, which of course was free competition, was already at this period giving way to mergers and cartels, leading to monopolies in the control of prices in world markets. And similar developments were happening even then in banking, and the merging of bank capital with industrial capital, and the export of capital itself as distinct from the export of commodities. And this, of course, allowed rich countries to export capital to poorer countries. Perhaps the poorer countries where profits were high, but also through loans, accompanied by stipulations that some of the loans were actually spent on purchases in the country of origin. And so who are the individuals who decide if a country goes to war? Are their motives always shared by their populations and seen as sufficient reasons for going to war? How do rulers persuade their populations to support a war? If we can understand the political, social and economic structures of society in which World War I emerged, and how these led to the war, can we hope that it will encourage us to really work to try to change those structures and to develop new ones which would encourage peace rather than war? And so we have two speakers to discuss these imperialistic rivalries and how they led to World War I and how it emerged, and to discuss Britain's role in that. And firstly, we're going to have Jerry Doherty. And Jerry is a retired head schoolmaster, so he's very good at teaching us all what we're about. And he has written a most interesting book, which some of you may have read already, with his co-author, Jim McGregor. And the book is called Hidden History, The Secret Origins of the First World War. I've read it and it's an extremely interesting book, and Jerry is going to tell us about it. And then we have a respondent who will be Manus O'Riordan. And Manus also is an author, a historian and an author, as well as former head of research at SIPTO. And Manus is joint author with Francis Devine of James Connolly, Liberty Hall and the 1916 Rising, which is on sale in the bookshop. And just when I'm talking about our own authors who are there, I'd like to mention 2 more books. One of those is by Eddie Glacken, and it's called The Bloody Trail of Imperialism, The Origins of the First World War. That's on sale in the bookshop too. And another one I've been asked to mention is by the joint authors John Boyd and Brian Denny, and it's called The First World War, 100 Years of Imperialism and Resistance. But now, first of all, I'm very, very happy to call on Jerry Doherty to talk to us about the inter-imperialist rivalry and World War I and Britain's role.
They usually don't let me anywhere near a microphone, especially if there's music on. But we're free of that at the present moment. I hope everyone can hear me properly. First of all, can I say my co-sinner, my colleague Jim McGregor, who would desperately have wished to have been here with us today. He's not been terribly well. He had an operation a couple of months ago. He's making a good recovery. We thought he might be able to join us, but he hasn't been able to. But he does send his best wishes. Can I also thank everybody before I start. I've never had the pleasure of being at the Grave School before, and this whole weekend has been a revelation to me. A special thanks to Tony, who has worked hard to put together the whole agenda, and also to those who have met over the weekend, because I have received nothing but kindness, and rarely have I been in a company which is so profoundly switched on. I really have enjoyed the depth of the debate and yeah, the differences, and I think that's entirely positive and says a lot about this whole group. We all know about the First World War. We all know, if we did history at school, secondary school in Scotland, I did higher history. So, the higher history teacher instructed the entire class. Here are the 4 causes of the First World War. When you get a question on the First World War, here are the 4 paragraphs that you will now write upon. Paragraph 1 will be about German imperial ambitions. Paragraph 2 will be about the naval race. Paragraph 3 will be about the system of alliances. And paragraph 4 will be the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. If you want an A or a B pass, please discuss some of that and write a conclusion. And that's how we were taught. And the unfortunate thing is that seeps into the psyche. And as we grow older and we begin to think about, really, did a world war happen because Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo? It still is very difficult sometimes to move past the original ideas which have been put in our head. When Tony sent me the title, Inter-Imperialist Rivalry, I thought, jings, that sounds good, I'll talk to that, but what does it mean? And the reason why I think like this is that what Jim and I are trying to do, and what I want to really support very strongly, is that we try and get rid of general titles like imperialism and look behind it at who is doing what, who manipulated the events that happened. So we move, if you like, from the general to the particular. Our thesis is that a very small group of very influential and powerful men led Britain and the Empire, and that's Scotland and Ireland, into war with one objective, and that was to crush, not beat, crush, the main rival to Anglo-Saxon predominance over the known world. In other words, Germany was the rival, the one country who at that particular point in time, at the end of the 19th, the start of the 20th century, the one country whose economic and industrial growth was fast overshadowing Britain across the globe. Markets were being lost. New designs from Germany were better. Their salesmanship was terrific. Do you know, these Germans were producing brochures in the native language to sell these things, instead of expecting them to learn English. It was a different mindset. And the answer was not to compete properly. Our thesis is that war against Germany was planned for 15 to 20 years over that period, and it was successfully achieved. I don't for a second think or go with the view that we sleptwalked into war. No. I think it's far, far deeper than that. Going to war was a carefully orchestrated decision, and it wasn't someone else's fault. It was taken by a small select cabal, and once all the necessary conditions were in place, we, Britain and Ireland, were bounced into war, were catapulted into war. It happened within the space of such a short period of time that opposition was virtually impossible. We are lied to by government. I could never have said that 50 years ago, 60 years ago. In primary school, I remember looking up at the map of the world and the British Empire. I didn't realise that the red actually was very significant and cynically really probably was blood, dominated the classroom. What we tried to say, or what Jim and I have been trying to say, is what we're taught in our schools and in universities continues the myths. War was a matter of strategy, not an accident. The evidence, a lot of the evidence of this has been removed. And the incriminating evidence, the really deep proof, has been absolutely wiped out, shredded, burned, and has left behind a lot of lies and misconceptions and obfuscations. Our starting point of reference is an American academic, Professor Carroll Quigley. He wrote a seminal work called The Anglo-American Establishment. It's not so much a narrative but a signpost. In fact, it's a terribly bad read, especially the first 4 or 5 chapters, which looks as though he's continued the book of Genesis, so that, you know, Jacob begat Pan and whoever, and so it goes forth, because it is really a record of all the English aristocracy and their families and all the posts that they held. But once you get past that, once it takes a more objective view of, and stands back a little, he has some amazingly astute observations to make. It does have one point which really, and at times he does worry us very much, but on one of his pages he regretted that amongst other nations Ireland has broken away from the British Commonwealth, and he attributed it to the fact that the persons in control failed to absorb the British way of life. It's an interesting comment. However, his work has helped us identify the men behind the scenes, and that's what I want to get to. Those who boasted that they would rather command real power than have the trappings of office. Some call them the men behind the scenes, the money power, all these vague titles. We've tried to identify them by name. And then what did we go and do? We gave it a title called The Secret Elite. But at least in this instance that we've put before you today, at least we've tried to map out who they were and their areas of influence. So follow please with me the impact on Britain's dynamic change of direction in the earliest days of the 20th century. And I think you might begin to understand, as we did slowly and painfully, exactly what Quigley's talking about. Carroll Quigley pointed to a very interesting triple penetration that this group had achieved of that penetrated politics, the press, and the writing of history. In following that through, we would add 2 more. We would add international finance and banking and industry. And that those who actually have the power behind the politicians, behind governments, are still here, and this is where they originated. His story starts with Cecil Rhodes, Rhodes of Rhodesia, the man who, with the Rothschild banking funding, bought and controlled the Kimberley diamond and gold mines, and was partly responsible for the Boer War itself. He is Rhodes of the Jameson raid and a whole host of things, but I'm not allowed to go into it because I've been told my time is definitely 50 minutes, or the roof will fall in. Cecil Rhodes, a journalist whose name has virtually been airbrushed from history, a guy called William Stead, a very influential journalist who wrote for the Pall Mall Gazette. He was an investigative journalist at a time when that was an unknown phrase. And he did a huge amount of good in unearthing the abuses of prostitution of young children in London in the 1890s. His value was that he understood the power of the press, of the use of this new media to put forward big and broad ideas. And the third dark figure, I would say, is Reginald Brett, Lord Esher. I doubt if anyone in the room has heard of Lord Esher, but I'll come to him in a minute in some detail. These three, Rhodes, Stead and Brett, met and decided, and this is what Quigley's book says, to set up a secret society and whose aim was to control British foreign policy, renew the Anglo-Saxon bond between Britain and the USA, and spread what they considered the all good in English ruling class traditions and values, to expand the British Empire in a world they believed they were destined to control. Two more very important people followed shortly. One was Lord Natty Rothschild, and the other was Alfred Milner. If there's one man I would like you to have whose life and CV I'd like you to have a look at some point that suits you, let it be Alfred Milner. He has been carefully and successfully airbrushed from British history, and he is the most repeatedly important man in actually manipulating what's happening. Milner was key to the whole of the strategy that I'm about to discuss with you. Basically, his power and his support stemmed from Oxford University, not exclusively Balliol College, but largely, and All Souls, from friends in the aristocracy and the elite London clubs of Grillions and The Club. Membership exclusively for the influential, the politically influential, the literary influential, and the journalistic influential. Milner described himself as a British race patriot. 6 years ago, I'd never heard of Alfred Milner. And I say to you again, his is a career worth looking at. We now believe him to be the most important, influential, able and effective imperialist in British history. He is the man who, by his own admission, caused the Boer War. I know that must sound like a ridiculously outlandish statement. There's a superb book by Thomas Packenham called The Boer War. If you ever have to read one book about the Boer War, it is that. And in it he absolutely quotes Milner's letters. He apologises actually in doing so, that he really should be ashamed, but he had no option but to cause the Boer War. And he worked ceaselessly thereafter to promote the empire and to lead it towards the war that was coming, the war that they had ordained was necessary, the war against Germany. Right. My first point then is that there was a group of exceptionally powerful men who recognised the need to radically shake up British foreign policy and manoeuvre the empire into war to crush the old order in Europe, but in particular Germany. The new cry that Cato would have loved for them was Germania delenda est, and he really meant it. The Boer War had proved to be an absolutely important wake-up call for Britain. The British Army had been all but humbled by these veldt farmers, and this proud army which marched in its scarlet was totally unfit for war. There was international glee in America and in Europe at the folly of the British Army. In Ireland, the Home Rule Party openly opposed the enforced conquest of the Boer republics. In Britain, there was a loud opposition from important liberals, like Lord George, for one. But Milner was a man of steel. He was not a politician worried about being elected at the next election. He didn't have that kind of constituency, because already he was influencing from the inside. He came out with the famous phrase, "Disregard the screamers." How interesting. Disregard the screamers. When I tell you that at that point in time, the screamers were those who were raising awareness of the concentration camps in South Africa, the concentration camps built to keep the Boer women and children away from their husbands who were fighting. And in these concentration camps, 25,000 people died. That's kind of been airbrushed from school histories too. But Milner saved the gold mines. He saved the diamond mines. He brought in coolies from China so that they could be worked. Unfortunately for him, at the time when a Liberal government was going to be introduced, he also allowed severe punishment to be part and parcel of the whole trend. And that was to come back and bite him royally. Milner saved the gold mines. But criticism of him grew amongst the Liberal sector, not amongst the Conservatives, not amongst his own people. He set up plans to rebuild South Africa with able administrators. He was a man of great ability. And he went back to England and chose his administrators from Oxford, from Balliol, from All Souls. He took out all these young men. One of them was John Buchan. I probably won't have, Buchan the author, I probably won't have enough time, or be allowed enough time to extrapolate on that, but if anyone wants to ask a question about it later, I would be pleased to explain Buchan's role in all of this. He had to take a serious look at the future of the empire. And these young men that he took over to South Africa, they were called Milner's Kindergarten. These young men, all exceedingly able, and when they came back to Britain, they took up posts, paid posts through Rhodes's funds. Rhodes left a great deal of money, not just for his inside the trustees, not just for fellowships. And they began to promote the empire and the empire's future and how the empire might be developed. And very importantly, the need to defend the empire against aggressors. But the first point of change came before the Liberal government of 1906. It was an abandonment of the old order of isolation. Something happened which had never happened before. With Lord Lansdowne as the Foreign Secretary, without debate, without reference to Parliament in any way, there was no cabinet discussion on the matter. All of a sudden, Britain signed an alliance in 1902 with Japan. That was stunning. I mean, if you have alliances with nobody and the first one you have is with Japan, where did that come from? Well, it caught everyone by surprise, and anyway, the information was released just as Parliament was rising for, as is usual, its timing was perfect to keep any criticism down. What was this about? Well, the answer was this. After some lengthy debate amongst themselves, it had been decided that Japan was the best nation to police the Far East on Britain's behalf, because out there Russia was our biggest fear. Russian expansion at that point in time, with the Trans-Siberian Railway almost finished, worried us greatly. Because what was Russia after? China? India, the jewel in the crown. Oh yes. Afghanistan, that's not good. Persia, that's not good at all. The alliance was made with Japan. And what happened was that Japan actually and effectively began to represent British interests out in that part of the world, out in the Far East. Basically, Russian ambition was too risky for the Foreign Office. The long-term threat was that if unchecked, Russia would curve its influence right round the India, Persia, and what's next? The ailing Ottoman Empire, and capture their jewel in the crown, which would be Constantinople. Russia had to be taken out. What happened was a great war between Russia and Japan, which Japan won hands down. Absolutely hands down. I saw recently a Discovery television programme about the Battle of Tsushima. Tsushima, naval battle, probably more important than Trafalgar, but equally as important anyway. Because Britain and Russia had no regard for each other, the Russians had to take their Baltic fleet right round from the Baltic, right the way round. Unfortunately, in the middle of the North Sea, there was a little unplanned altercation with some trawlermen from Hull, the result of which, in the confusion, several of the Hull trawlers were sunk, and of course there were riots in the streets of London over this. Britain refused to let Russia have any coaling stations all the way round and slowed them down all the way round. And by the time they reached the Far East, the Russian fleet was not in a particularly good state. Then came the great Japanese Navy, sailed right into them and literally wiped them out. And I'm sitting watching the television and goes, so far, okay, now tell them. Now tell them. No, that wasn't our Japanese Navy. The four great super destroyers that the Japanese had, the Shishikima, the Kikaka, the Fuji, and the Asahi, were all built in Britain. They were built on the Thames, on the Clyde, and in Barrow-in-Furness. And if you like, the surrogate navy wiped out the Russian Navy, and in that same instance wiped out Britain's worst fears in the Far East. And that was why the treaty had been signed in 1902. That itself changed the dynamic. By 1904, Russia was virtually friendless, vulnerable to a sympathetic approach, and actually became a key part of the building block for the new order. Russia had to be remoulded, and it was. The next part of this equation, with a big change in foreign policy, unique change in foreign policy, was the ejection of the Tory government. They actually all resigned towards the end of 1905, and there was an election in 1906 which swept the Liberals into power. They had 397 seats alone. The Home Rulers from Ireland had 82. And Labour, this new young party, which might, I seriously hope it doesn't ever get to 28, but it better look after itself, because it is in decline at the present moment. One is very hopeful, if I take an aside, that Jeremy Corbyn will make a big change there. This massive change in government. And this was a government elected on peace, reform, retrenchment. It was the anti-war party of Campbell Bannerman and David Lloyd George. This would change everything. You know, of course, that it didn't. And the reason why it didn't was at its core. At its core, there had been implanted three, and I'll use the word imperialist, but three of Milner's best friends were actually not just in the cabinet, but with Haldane, their names, I'm very cautious that I don't want to throw too many names at you, but Herbert Asquith, Richard Haldane, and Sir Edward Grey were actually given the 3 key posts of state. Haldane went to the War Office, Grey to the Foreign Office, and this had been ordained in secret at a meeting in Scotland, approved by the King and Lord Isher well in advance of the actual change of government. In fact, the King invited Campbell Bannerman to meet with him, and he suggested to him kindly that at his age it might be a good idea if he went up to the House of Lords and let that young chap Asquith take over. Campbell Bannerman wouldn't have it. And for 2 years, in a very trying time, his wife was seriously ill, and she passed away, and it did drain him of a lot of his strength and energy. But the important part is that with this huge change in government, foreign policy had not been changed at all. Behind the scenes, there were no moves. In fact, things got even more complex. Changes had been afoot. Conversations were being held between the British Army, the French Army, and Belgian interests about how this new British force that was going to be put together from the War Office, how it would develop. Very important. But hold on a second. Britain had no alliances. What were you doing planning for war? You've got your soldiers, your army, the French, the Belgians. That can't be right. The Belgians were neutral. The Belgians were there. Underneath what appeared to be the controlling factor of the British cabinet and the Foreign Office, there was yet another very, very supremely influential group called the Committee of Imperial Defence. This group, which met unknown to most of the cabinet, regularly, was chaired permanently by Lord Isher. And this was a group which planned the defence of India, looked at strategies years and years ahead of time, looked at strategies, one of which was whether or not it would be successful to attack the Dardanelles if we wanted to take Constantinople. And at that point in time, the conclusion they came to was no, it wouldn't be. We would lose that. That was to be later forgotten. What is important is that from 1906, a military group from the army was actually meeting with the French in particular to build up their tactics, to build up how they would address war against Germany. The British Expeditionary Force, which came out of this, and so intent were they that they would have a British Expeditionary Force, a small, specialised, professional army, that the King called together all the lieutenants of the counties of Britain, Scotland, certainly of Scotland and England and Wales. They would have, I'm sure the Irish would have been there too. They would have to have been. And he told them that he did not want any obstruction whatsoever to Mr. Haldane's proposals, that it had had his blessing and it was their job to carry this through. And so a very small, sharp, specially trained force, the British Expeditionary Force, was created. And its objective was not Egypt, not the protection of India, solely trained to take position in the north of France as part of a combined British-French unit in a war with Germany. And this had been planned and was planned from 1906. Henry Wilson, who became Sir Henry Wilson, who was very influential amongst the generals, he used to take his summer holidays in the north of France and cycle about and do maps of the canals and stuff like this, which is indicative of how deep that was. The Belgian general Duncarne, he discussed the allocation of Belgian interpreters of accommodation, of where hospital units might go in the event of this coming war and the BEF being in northern France. The next point I would wish to make inside this is to congratulate the very best Foreign Secretary that Britain ever had, the most successful man. And it's not Sir Edward Grey. Sir Edward Grey got thrown out of Oxford University, came back later on to get a third, couldn't speak any foreign languages, but the man who could was King Edward VII. Edward VII is often lampooned as just a womanizer and, you know, all of that kind of, there's a book called Edward the Caresser, yes. And that kind of jovial, isn't he Jack the Lad, really tight image suited fine, because behind that image lay a very sharp brain, and a man who spent his time as king going round the coasts of Europe, especially through the Mediterranean, to influence the crown heads of Europe and take them away from links with Germany. In particular, his biggest success was Italy. Now, when you were taught in school about the Triple Alliance, it was Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. And what was declared? Italy was nowhere to be seen. Italy had been successfully disengaged from the Triple Alliance. And that, credit for that must go absolutely to Edward. Unfortunately, he went and died in 1910, which was actually a bit of an inconvenience to say the least. But his work had been done, and a great deal of the disengagement had already taken place. And he did spectacularly different things. For example, when he went in 1903 to Naples, he took a trip up to Rome and visited Pope Leo XIII, absolutely unknown. He was the first monarch since Henry VIII that even talked to a pope. Not that Henry VIII did, because they didn't have telephones at the time. But if you get my meaning, here he was engaging. He was engaging every single aspect that he could to influence, and did so very successfully, without any specific alliances. But then, of course, came the Entente Cordiale. He was very popular in France, and that was hugely helpful. He knew all of the best brothels in Paris. And I'm not suggesting that was influential, but it certainly gave him an image behind which his real work could hide. The Entente Cordiale, this rapport that suddenly appeared between France and Britain, I think it's Roger Casement, I think he called it the most unnatural of alliances. And so it was, if you look at it historically. But you do not change a nation's opinion simply by taking steps behind the scenes. This was an era where the press was more and more and more important. And Milner, who had actually been a journalist for some point in time, was very, very aware of that. The press turned from attacking France to attacking Germany. There was spy mania of the highest order. The Times and the Daily Mail were up for sale, excuse me. And Lord Isher actually interviewed Harmsworth, who was going to buy the Times. He's better known as Lord, oh, I'm going to say Rothermere, and that's absolutely wrong, Northcliffe. Before Northcliffe bought the Times, he was interviewed by Lord Isher and permitted to buy the Times as long as the editors and the editorials remained exactly where they should be. But what is interesting is the amount of anti-German spy stories, negative stories that peopled the whole time. The best of all was, and he's an absolutely, it's worth reading, William Le Queux, Q-U-E-U-X. Q-U-E-U-X. a tremendously badly written book called The Invasion of 1910. This book was commissioned by Northcliffe for the Daily Mail. Its military advisor was Lord Roberts, the most senior of the retired British generals ever. It had a naval advisor, H.H. Wilson, who was recognised internationally as a genuine naval advisor, and he was a wonderful story which ran for weeks. The invasion of southern England. When they discovered that not enough readers actually were in the south of England, they changed the route, so it went up by Sheffield and then came back down again. Ridiculous. But there it was, and it did its purpose. Milner, after he came back from South Africa, ran into flack. He ran into criticism about the way that the coolies from China had been, and that was the term that they were called, had the treatment they got was awful. He was severely reprimanded in Parliament, and he didn't take kindly to it. Churchill made a speech saying, look, let's leave poor Milner alone. He's had a hard time, and he'll never get a job, and he's not got a pension. Yeah, right. The man who saved the Kimberley diamond mines and the gold mines, he instantly had a job as Rothschild's man on the Rio Tinto. He had a job as a director of the Bank of Egypt. And he had to turn down a directorship of the Times because he didn't have enough time to do that. And what he really wanted to do, which was promote the empire and promote the need for the empire to be ready for war. And what Milner and his people did was set up what they call round table groups. Now, you know, think what would happen, Roy, for example, if your peace group could get the backing of the Rothschilds, and that you had the equivalent of a war chest of £5 million a year that you could draw on to promote the good work and intentions and trying to change people's opinion. That's what they had. Incredible amount of money backing them, behind them, and they organised imperial press conferences at which all the top people, including the king, turned up. Imperial conferences for the prime ministers and the dominions. And of course the king gave out some knighthoods to a South African, a Canadian and an Australian newspaper owner. And you can see how the influence was growing and how very, very important this was to actually influencing people's opinion. A devil in me would like to say, but the real cause of the First World War was Ireland. If only to get people to wake up. So, I'm going to say the real cause of the First World War wasn't Ireland, but it was the abuse of the situation in Ireland. And this is a very critical element which is ignored. It falls into the "it just so happened" category. Every time you say "it just so happened," Milner happened to be in Paris. Yeah, right. You know, Blair happened to be in... Yes, of course it just happened to be. So, how did Ireland come to command such a key role in the causes of the First World War? And it's because these people in the Foreign Office and all of the elements that they control, Milner in particular with all his henchmen, were like raptors. They attacked by making you look at one part and they were coming at you from the other side. And that was part of the blessing of the civil strife in Ireland. The political arithmetic in Britain had changed entirely in the two elections of 1910. Both elections resulted in virtually exactly the same numerical arithmetic statistics. And the Liberals were dependent on the Home Rulers. And the Home Rulers were definitely not in favour of anything like a war or the Empire. To the secret elite, the move to extract Ireland from the Empire was unthinkable, and their role in supporting Ulster was absolute. Ireland played a major part in the strategic deception used by the secret elite. It so looked like that a civil war was going to take place. The Germans believed this to be true, and that's a matter of record. They were banking on it. And the whole atmosphere that was generated gave them every belief that Britain was on the brink of a civil war and very unlikely to be involved in a continental conflict. Yet again, my good friend Alfred Milner played a major role in supporting and supplying Ulster and the North. Milner, Rudyard Kipling, Rothschild, Lord Waldorf Astor, Lord Ivy, that sounds like a pint of Guinness to me in another world, and the Duke of Bedford put together massive funds for the North. I mean, Kipling and Astor gave £30,000 each. This is 1912, 1913. Rothschild and Ivy gave £10,000 each. There was a war chest provided for Ireland of £8 million in current funds. That's a lot of backing.